Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Now, I don't know about you, but I always feel some excitement around the Academy Awards, which take place this Monday. I do love movies, and I watch them whenever I can. But since the pandemic started, movie making and movie watching have dramatically changed for me and for millions around the world. But movies and the film industry have always been evolving, reflecting, imagining, and even forecasting changes in our world and who we are and who we want to be. Here to give us some background and context to the films we watch is Sarah Bay-Cheng. She's the Dean of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University. And we're going to explore the meaning of movies over the last half century and what we've learned from them. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for coming on our podcast.
Hi, Mary. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, before we get into the meaning of movies, I would really like to know what movies have meant to you.
Gosh, so I grew up with movies. I am the child of two theater majors who were obsessed with movies and took me to movies as a kid. My earliest memories were going to Disney films, which at the time were really special because they only released films every 7 years from the so-called Disney Vault. So unlike my children who could watch kind of whatever movie they wanted to watch whenever, we had to wait very specially for certain films to come out and then only see them in the theater and then wait another 7 years for them to be available. So I think in my mind, movies remain a kind of special, very precious experience.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. And so that's why I'm so looking forward to our conversation and to be able to go back in time as we're doing. I mean, we're going to go back half a century to the 70s. And I'm wondering what you would say about the 70s and how noteworthy they were when it came to Hollywood films.
Oh, well, I should say, first of all, that my background in film, I came to film through theater. And I've always looked at film and theater together in lots of different ways. And this is especially important in the 1970s for a couple of reasons. One is that the 70s are marked by a few major changes, but one is the rise of so-called method acting and a generation of particularly American actors that we think of as being kind of the quintessential necessary elements of 1970s filmmaking. So people like Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep and Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman. And all of those folks were actually trained by members of a theater company that had started in the 1930s called the Group Theater. And so the group theater was based on this idea, well, a few different ideas, but one that there were no small actors or no small parts, only small actors. So no matter how large or small your role was, you were to commit to it entirely. And through what was first the Stanislavski system and then later the Lee Strasberg method, there was this development of a kind of rawness and authenticity in acting that you were trying to articulate and demonstrate deeply felt, true, authentic emotions in one's performance. And that becomes a little challenging in a theatrical context because, you've got to do 8 shows a week. And so, going back to an emotional wound and really digging into that pain can be quite challenging to do over and over and over again. But for filmmaking, and particularly the kind of raw, gritty films that we associate with, like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese of the 1970s, Spielberg as well, you really have, those are much better suited to that kind of acting style. So there's a big shift in the acting of the 1970s that becomes a lot of what, at least in the American context, we think of as kind of quintessentially great acting.
So when you say there was this shift, right? What was it shifting from?
Well, a good example in the 1960s would be somebody like Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady. Or, if for those of you who enjoy films aimed at children, Doctor Doolittle, and these were very stylized, really excellent, but also kind of affected, and acting that looked like acting. There was a kind of
Mm.
preciousness to it and a demonstration of it. Or take somebody like Audrey Hepburn, right? Or Katharine Hepburn. Actually, Katharine Hepburn's a great example because she was invited to join the group theater and she declined. In part because she
Oh.
did not want to subsume her role or herself into a role. In fact, they asked her if she wanted to be an actor, and she said, "Darling, I don't want to be an actor. I want to be a star." And so she never joined the group theater. She went to Hollywood and became Katharine Hepburn. So more power to her. But there's a sense in which there's a kind of star quality of acting, especially certain films, and a certain celebrity or it factor. And the group theater was all about getting rid of the individual and really subsuming yourself within the role. So, for example, there's
Mm.
a very famous story of uh, Dustin Hoffman making The Marathon Man with the great British stage and film actor Laurence Olivier. And they show up for a very famous scene in which the Dustin Hoffman's character is going to be, is being tortured by the character played by Olivier, who's a Nazi dentist, right? So it's this really brutal kind of
No, I
extended torture
remember it.
scene.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dustin Hoffman apparently, as story goes, showed up on the set and just looked terrible. I guess he really was just like, he looked tired and had big bags under his eyes. And Laurence Olivier was like, "Oh my goodness, what's wrong? You look terrible." And Dustin Hoffman was like, "Well, I haven't slept for 3 days. I'm so I could be in the scene." And allegedly Laurence Olivier turned to Hoffman and said, "Oh, why don't you try acting, my dear boy? It's much easier."
That is
That
it
I would
illustrates
say
it
is
perfectly. Yeah.
a good shift, right? From a kind of stylized notion of
Yeah.
acting as craft to this really visceral authenticity on screen.
It's very inwards, isn't it? That kind of acting, that sort of method acting. It sounds to
Well,
me.
it is, but I mean, but in part because as an actor on screen, you don't have to push or project the performance as far. The camera does a lot of that work for you.
Mm.
So it's you can be much smaller in certain ways and know that your performance is going to be amplified by
Mhm.
the mechanisms of the screen. Rosie O'Donnell actually tells a great story about performing in A League of Their Own with Gina Davis. And Rosie O'Donnell, who also came from a theatrical background and particularly musicals, had a big, was used to performing for the stage and having a big, very, kind of prominent personality. And she recalls a story where she was standing next to Gina Davis and they did a take and she was like, "Well, that was going to be terrible because Gina Davis is not doing anything. She's clearly not acting and nothing is happening and we're going to have to redo it." And then she watched The Daily and Gina Davis looks completely expressive and Rosie O'Donnell looks, like totally overacting and over exaggerating because the camera has amplified everything that Gina Davis was doing. And so Rosie O'Donnell had to pull her own performance down from a theatrical frame and scale to a cinematic, in which the camera and the filmmaking apparatus, particularly for big movie screens, would do a lot of that amplification work. So I do think that this really changes in part because of 70s era filmmaking.
Yeah, but I think actually what I meant by it being internal is that it feels to me as if, I mean, not that I've ever done method acting or I know a heck of a lot about it, but it sounds as if someone is really internalizing this character and living it, like actually trying to live that
Yes.
character and being totally empathetic. right, to the role. Is that true?
It really depends. So method acting was, as Strasberg imagined it, was that you would have an emotional experience or be able to recreate for yourself an emotional experience in which you would be reliving the emotion of an emotion of the past in the present as if it were really happening to you. What it became associated with over time, in part because of how Strasberg developed, but also how his students did, was that you essentially tried to live as much of the character and the character's life as you can. So Daniel Day-Lewis is another one who is famous for going on
Oh,
set
yes.
and insisting that everyone only refer to him as his character and never breaking character around those. So that's now what we sort of associate with this extreme form of method acting. But
Right.
But it wasn't just, it doesn't always have to be that extreme. But you're absolutely right. The focus is very internal and on one's own personal, emotional experience that conveys that authenticity on screen. The film camera picks up so much detail, and the big screen amplifies so much of what we see that you can see why authenticity became such a key role, especially in really the era of the big blockbuster, which was the 70s, including, films that reflected the kind of auteur sensibility and art house sensibility, again in American filmmaking in particular. So the influences of the French New Wave and Italian neorealism, but then as rendered in films like Coppola's The Godfather, and which really was one of these kind of sine qua non films of the 1970s that people pointed to again and again, or any number of films by Scorsese, Mean Streets being a really good example as well. And that becomes a lot of what people begin to aspire to, and perhaps is also why in that period we also have the emergence of the blockbuster.
Yes. I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, when you say blockbuster and 70s, my mind right away goes to Jaws. I think about Jaws.
Sure. Well, Jaws was the first big, if I'm not mistaken, was the first big summer blockbuster, which was it was huge at the box office. It was a popular film. Everybody saw it. It became part of the zeitgeist and part of the consciousness. And that film was 1975. And then just a couple of years later, you have Star Wars, in 1977. And that also then introduces, becomes a big sci-fi. So you had kind of Jaws on the horror front and Star Wars on the sci-fi front. I mean, it's also interesting that these are genre films. And so that they were very, I mean, arguably The Godfather is too, as a kind of gangster picture. So it's also this rise of genre at this period that becomes incredibly appealing and popular.
Yeah. And how do you define blockbuster?
Typically, blockbuster refers to a film that is commercially successful, and that, if I'm remembering correctly, the idea was that it would literally, like, lineups would go around the block, right? It was this idea of a high demand, really commercial, mass media, popular film. And I think what we see is that in the with Jaws, for example, is it just did incredibly well at the box office, and it became, because at the end of the day, Hollywood is a money machine more than as much as it is anything else. And so what it became was a model of what then later productions were trying to achieve. So everybody kind of saw the summer genre popular film as a real goal, and trying to target films that would tap into that audience.
I find it interesting that I don't think I've ever heard blockbuster associated with foreign films. Even though we have had some foreign films do very well, I've never heard them referred to as blockbuster films.
Well, over time, I think that's true. I mean, over time, I think what we've also seen is that the term blockbuster has tended to be associated with with popular and commercial films, which we tend to associate overwhelmingly with Hollywood, and think in some ways that films from other parts of the world are always kind of slightly outside that commercial genre. And I mean, still to this day, we've had any number of very popular foreign language, non-English films that do very well in Hollywood, and they're almost always described as a surprise. Right? No matter how popular they were in their right? Yeah. It's almost as if like, oh my gosh, another film without car chases and special effects has become a commercial success. How did this happen? And we see that kind of rhetoric over and over and over again. So it's almost as if that, and we see this a lot in Hollywood, tropes and sort of habits become the norm. And it's very difficult sometimes for us to get out of our thinking around those.
Yeah, because do you feel that we are still chasing, that whether it's production companies or directors, that they're still chasing that idea of blockbuster today? Are we still after that dream of, lineup, maybe not lineups right now after the pandemic, right, but, big box office, huge, right? Receipts coming in.
Well, when you look at how expensive it is to make films, I mean, films have always been a very expensive enterprise, even from their beginning. Like just the materiality of the celluloid or the video or the digital recording, right? It is such a technological art form that makes it incredibly expensive. It's also expensive in terms of human resources, right? The number of people required to work on even a small film. I mean, the best thing you can do is go to, I do this sometimes, is I always watch all the credits. Anytime I see a film, I sit there. I'm like the last annoying person in the movie theater. Like
I get it. Yeah,
my partner is like embarrassed and has gotten up and left. My children are like, oh, we should really go away. There's like somebody trying to clean up around me, to get the next, and I'm just like, nope. And
you're like, wait a minute, I see the key grip.
That's right.
Who was the key grip?
Right. I haven't gotten to the best boys yet, and I'm like, I need to see where they're on location, and are there special thank yous? Yes. But it's really interesting, looking at and timing some of those, and how long the credits take to roll, and which films have longer credits, and what you will see is that even on a very small film with maybe a couple of locations or all in a single set, you will still see an extensive list of people that's required to make that. And for example, one of the Academy Award nominees for Best Picture this year that I saw last summer, I mean, the very quintessence of a blockbuster, I would say, right? Top Gun Maverick.
Maverick, yeah.
I mean, I think those credits were over 10 minutes long. I mean, I sat there for forever, like Unit 2 photography, I mean, it's just like so much work.
Do you remember when the Blair Witch Project came out? And that was like was it the 90s? What a surprise, right? The shaky camera that then everybody tried to copy and then they made fun of as well. But, you have 8 students or however many students from some university in California, and they did this. And it was, it was huge. It became huge, and for very, very little money. So, is part of it though that we're kind of geared to think that way? Big budget films, those are the ones that's going to do well, or those are the ones that people want to go see. Is that necessarily true?
Well, certainly film companies, like production companies, tend to go with, because even the cheapest film, a good example is Steven Soderbergh, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, right? From what is it, like 1990, 91. That was a quote unquote, cheap film, very simple, 3 actors, very small crew. Yep. And I think it was at the time considered to be really an inexpensive film for over $1 million in $1990, right? Which you're gonna like the mathematicians and economists will have to adjust for inflation, right? But I mean that was what a small film cost to produce. The investment, even a small investment, and certainly like the Blair Witch Project may not have cost a lot to film, but getting it, in post production and distribution and marketing and promotions, right? All of that becomes part of the commercial enterprise,
the whole machine
of bringing films out. So even inexpensive films are still incredibly resource intensive. So there's always a commercial pressure on film relative to the size and scope that it is, and it's hard to do it for. I mean, you do see certain exceptions, like Soderbergh's early film is one, Blair Witch Project is another. Michael Moore very famously, right, did Roger and Me, I think like on, with like a handful of credit cards that he, used to finance, and documentary certainly can do this. But even in those circumstances, they're still fairly resource intensive.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, that there's kind of no way around some of the basic costs, and especially once it comes out, the promotion, et cetera. But I always feel that well, for me anyway, there seems like this tension between films that are human centric and very focused on the human condition that may not cost a ton of money, as opposed to the films that are, full of CGI and on location here and and a million different actors and resources being used. And then at the end, I think, okay, which film did I really enjoy? Do you know?
Well, I mean, there's always this tension between the commercial side of filmmaking and the art making, and the art of film. And what I would say too is, and this also kind of goes back to the 1970s, they're not always mutually exclusive. I mean, one of like sometimes you have big epics, like let's think of, Lawrence of Arabia, right? That's a little bit before the 70s, I think it's 1966, 67. Which is, obviously an epic, hugely expensive film, and yet has moments of real pathos and a very human centered story. Another one that I really love is Warren Beatty's Reds, which again has a kind of, I think it's like almost or
grand
even over
scope.
3 hours, but has some really wonderful, little moments, and a very human story. So it's not always that these things can are at odds with one another. I mean, I think a lot of people might look at and what a sort of model for the blockbuster too is like, a film like Gone with the Wind, or The Wizard of Oz. I mean, these were big, epic, Technicolor, hugely sort of popular, commercially oriented films, and yet, became a permanent part of the Hollywood zeitgeist. I mean, we still, refer to, Dorothy clicking her heels together to go home, and elements from those films show up in even in contemporary cinema.
Do you feel, because the 70s, it was an important decade, and there were all these changes that happened, which you're talking about, do you feel that we see threads of that, coming right through to present day, that the 70s had an impact and still has an impact on filmmaking today and the way we watch films?
So absolutely. And not just sort of thematically or in terms of acting, although I think acting was a big one, in terms of method and the, what I think of as the American school of this kind of raw authenticity on screen of living the circumstances. Certainly a certain kind of Hollywood auteur, and the role of the blockbuster and emergence of the blockbuster. But the other thing that I think maybe is less often appreciated is not just the creation technologies, the cameras that were used, or the special effects in Star Wars and things like that. But also the emergence of, it's going to sound kind of dorky, but the emergence of the VCR. And this is a technology that actually that emerges in the 1970s, but becomes more widely adopted in the early to mid 80s. And people, may of a certain age, like me, will remember when our families got our first, VCR, and there was for a while, a big debate about, did you get VHS or Betamax? And, and that technology, but that I really believe that technology as a reception technology, as opposed to a production technology, changed the way we watch movies, because it suddenly allowed people to watch movies in their own home on their own time. Mm-hmm. And it reduced what had been an exclusively large format collective shared experience that you could only see, like I referred to when you asked me about what movies mean to me, and I mentioned I only got to see Disney movies once every 7 years. It introduced the idea of on demand and a consumer driven availability, but it also reduced the scale. And if you've ever seen films, big scale films from that era on VHS, before DVDs and before televisions got large enough to accommodate the aspect ratio of cinema, they used to have to cut up films through a technique called pan and scan, where only part of the cinematic image would ever be visible at any given time on your square television. And this actually changed the way, so James Cameron, for example, was a director who always did his own pan and scan. Like, he wanted to make the decision about what of the cinematic image you saw at any given moment. But I really believe, and it's that there's a kind of critical shift where filmmakers before the VCR only ever assume that their work is going to be seen on the big screen and in a cinema house. And that after the VCR, you see filmmakers beginning to understand and even anticipate the circulation of film and cinema as a home movie phenomenon. And I think that has some really interesting productive elements in films like, Richard Linklater's, some of his early, like Slackers, for example, or some of these weird little films that actually play pretty well on televisions, versus, to go back to Warren Beatty's Reds. This is a film that is really conceived of and meant to be experienced on the big screen, and doesn't really look quite right on a television. Or go back even further, something like, Citizen Kane is shot, Orson Welles shoots that film from below because he wants Kane to loom over you. But if you watch that film on your television, Kane is never going to loom over you, right? He's like you've shrunk him into a little space.
Well, you see, that raises a lot of questions, fast forwarding to today, and the fact that we are now watching on an even smaller screen, which would be our phone, right? So, no, what you say is so true, though, about the introduction of the VCR. That was just kind of prep work. It was just priming us for what was to come, which is now our phone. And we're watching on our phones. And as, you talk about on demand, it's so true. It's 24/7, anytime, day or night, and wherever we are, we can watch on our phones. What does that mean now to, how we're absorbing film? How are we absorbing it? What are we watching? And then, of course, how are films being made?
Well, there's a lot in there. The first question is, who is the we? In many ways, I think there are two impulses that are happening, or two movements happening simultaneously, but in opposite directions, which I find super interesting. One is that films and the consumption of media, so narrative, media. I won't even get into like gaming as films, or is that it is becoming hyper individualized. So through, everything from not just that you can watch anything you want at any time on your own individual mobile device, but that what you think to watch or what gets recommended to you to watch is also through, algorithmic culture increasingly individualized, right? So your Netflix recommendations are going to look different than my Netflix recommendations are going to look different from somebody else's. And what Google says, I think you're going to like this is going to be different, depending on what country I'm in, for example. So we're also just, it's not even what we're choosing. It's also what algorithms are choosing for us and presenting to us. So you're getting this kind of hyper individualization and in even a kind of a kind of solitary viewing, which we see one of the potential futures of cinema being in immersive environments, right? The head-mounted display and the watching films in the metaverse, where we're getting even more kind of, into our own personal space. But the other interesting phenomenon that's happening is the exact opposite, which is this, we might even think of it as a re-theatricalization of media, which is things like live experiences of popular media products. So here in Toronto, I'm recording today from the Cinespace Studios in Kipling Avenue in Toronto, where York has our motion media studio, and at one of the other Cinespace there is a production called the Bridgerton Experience. And they're doing another one that is opening soon called the Stranger Things Experience. And these are taking the television shows, Bridgerton and Stranger Things respectively, and people are able to go to them, attend, and participate and collectively, right, as a group, experience the media, that media kind of imaginative world, but to perform in it. So it seems to me that there are these two seemingly contrary impulses that are happening. One is that things to be really hyper individualized and that we consume films by ourselves. And the other to be that we not only want to experience the film collectively, but we want to collectively act and participate in the film itself, which I find, or in the movie, the TV show itself.
Do you know what? The thing, though, I guess that I'm still concerned about, going back to the former, the fact that it is very individualized, that these algorithms are catering to our taste, right? Nobody else's taste. It's my individual taste. And so they're feeding back to me what they think I want to see. And I mean, for me, that seems great. But then, what about all the things that I don't know that I might like?
Yeah.
One of the things I feel about going to the movies before, we had all these very revealing trailers, et cetera, is you would go and you really wouldn't know if you were going to like the film or not. But, you'd go, and then because you're there and you've already spent the money for the ticket, you're probably going to watch the whole thing, and it might even get better and you might like it. You're not going to leave. But at home, it's so easy to stop it and go on to something else and then something else and something else. Right. And, when you talk about these, kind of community experiences, whether it's Bridgerton or, Stranger Things, how many of those can you do? Like, those are just two, right? Two shows. It's just not possible to make a live experience of every movie, right?
No,
or many
that's very
movies.
true.
It's just not cost effective, right? And then you're only going to capture the people who were huge fans. Like they're already the converted. So there's something that concerns me about this. I don't know how you feel. Like, what are your thoughts about this kind of echo chamber that's happening?
So there's a film. Actually, there's two versions of a film. In 1990, the film was Total Recall, and it was the version with Arnold Schwarzenegger. They did a remake with Colin Farrell over a decade later. But the film with Schwarzenegger in I believe it was 1990 was an adaptation of a Philip K. Dick story called "We Can Remember It For You Wholesale." Right, Philip K. Dick often had these strange change titles. But the movie poster for Total Recall back in the 1990 version, one of the taglines for the advertising was, "How would you know if somebody stole your mind?" And I kind of think, as I'm listening to you, I kind of think that we might rephrase that question of, how would you know if somebody stole your taste? Right? In other words, how do you know what you like when all you see is things that have been automatically selected for you, based on what an algorithm or a certain site believes that you're going to like? So I do think that there is a concern in terms of this, what some scholars have talked about as the flattening of algorithmic culture and the siloing of what we are exposed to narratively, imaginatively. And I take this very seriously, because I actually think then my role as an educator with my students is to push against that and to show them and to introduce them to a lot of things that they don't like, or they don't know that they're going to like it. And I think the impetus for us as audiences in this current moment is to seek out things that are unfamiliar and that we don't know if we're going to like or not. Because so much about culture and especially entertainment is just trying to give us more of the same over and over and over again, because that's what keeps us engaged on a platform, or that's what makes us satisfied. And I do think there's a lot of, it can create a lot of siloing and the echo chamber that you talk about, which may, I'm not a political scientist, but certainly seems to be aligned with other phenomena that people have pointed out in social media and things like that.
Well, and I'm really, I'm glad to hear that you're going to feed people stuff they don't like, because that's our world. I mean, that, we live with all kinds of people and we don't like them all, or even, they might even just have, we may like them, but they have different views from us. Right. And they deserve to be heard. Right. It's not just our view we want to hear back at us. Like, how are we expected to, open up our worldview if all we're fed is our view coming back at us time and time again? I mean, I'm taking this, film very seriously, but I mean, I take film seriously, and I'm sure you do too. And I know a lot of people look at film and they, it's just entertainment. And in the end, it's kind of expendable. We're not going to die if we don't see a film. But I just feel film is like incredibly instructive. We learn so much from film. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, it certainly is one way that we create social norms, and how we understand the reality around us. And if we are only ever seeing the same kinds of stories, the same kinds of norms, it can be very seductive to believe that that's all there is, and that is dominant. I think it's critical, again, from an educational perspective, to ensure that people get exposed to lots of different things, because forget about things you don't like. How do you even know what you like if you're seeing the same kinds of things over and over and over and over again? Like when I'm like, whatever, scrolling on Instagram, I like the baby animal videos as much as anyone, but I don't know that I want to have a diet of exclusively like small baby animals as my media, consumption. And yet, if I let Instagram decide, it will be all baby animals all the time, until I tell it, right, that I want to look at something else. And so I feel like film and cinema, really has the potential to lull us into these kind of traps of familiarity, but it also, has the power to snap us out of it. And every once in a while, there are, significant films that seem to defy all the odds. Women Talking is a great one. I mean, you read about that film on paper, and you think no one is ever going to see this movie.
Yeah.
How or you read the book on which it's based. You're like, there is nothing about that narrative that says, oh yes, turn me into a Hollywood film. And yet, that's one of the films that's nominated for Best Picture this year and Best
Yeah,
Adapted
I totally
Screenplay.
agree. And yeah, and it deserves seeing. I feel strongly about that film. Yeah, it totally deserves seeing. So, I mean, having said all this though, and the fact that we're getting back what we like from these streaming platforms, what as far as content and what is actually out there, do you feel that there's a lot out there that's worth watching, especially coming out of the pandemic and the effect of the pandemic now on filmmaking? How do you feel?
I will be sort of openly optimistic. I actually think that there is a lot of great film and great media storytelling that is happening. And I think it's happening across different genres. I think it's happening across and in different national cinemas. One of the things that has been, for me, really wonderful about the last few years is that there has been a real attention to diversity across, not just internationally, but intranationally. Here in Canada, the attention on Indigenous narratives and Indigenous stories and Indigenous filmmaking, I think, has only increased. There's been attention to the things that are unique about Black filmmaking and, other uniquely and distinctly Canadian stories that I think is really powerful. But that's also happening in a context of tremendous national cinemas. So I was just traveling in Korea, and that is a country that has invested hugely in their cinema and media exports, and that has created just a number of wonderful, really amazing and quite brilliant films that, thanks to things like Netflix and streaming and other, are reaching much broader audiences than they ever would. So there's, in the history of cinema, it's rarely an all good, all bad situation, right? There's always good things with every new technological advance and challenges. There's always new opportunities and setbacks, because you're watching a cultural form that is
Mm-hmm.
responding to so many different pressures. Some of them are technological, some of them are social, some of them are political, but film is, as a visual medium, as an oral medium, as a migratory medium, I think will continue to be a really important way of human communication. And even in social media, what you see is like mini filmmaking, all
Yeah.
in all over the world, and so I'm quite optimistic that we are in and will continue to be in a really tremendous age of filmmaking.
I totally enjoyed this conversation, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Mary, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about my favorite films and ideas. So I really appreciate the invite.
That's Sarah Bay-Cheng. She is Dean of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University. Now, if you'd like to know more about Sarah and her work, you can check out our show notes. That is it for our show today. We hope you enjoyed it, and we would really appreciate your support. Please rate our podcast and subscribe and follow us on social. @Cram Ideas is our handle. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here for another Cram podcast.